history lesson. I focus on painting and drawing as my main medium. I teach across the city. Louder, sorry. One of the things I care about the most in my teaching as well as in my art making is tapping into really being intrinsically connected to my process and really trusting what I call a gut relationship to work or instincts to guide me. Even though a lot of things don't come in that way, that's one of the things I've learned to trust the most about myself and my process. And so what I'm going to show you today is 3 different types of work that span about 5 years of practice. One, these small studies that you can see on the left and right that are fairly small. I consider those like field studies or sketches, right? Not really finished work in the same way because they're about color, form, texture, finding an environment and trying to find a mood in the artwork. But they don't feel like finished artworks to me, even though they probably are to other people. This series was all dedicated to kind of an unexpected process of keeping your eyes open in your own studio and recognizing what emerges and documenting that. And then the final pieces, which are the large tapestries, are my most recent work that were just finished this summer actually. And I'm going to speak about them hopefully the most. But all of these, the paintings both came from different experiences traveling as well. So a lot of cultural influences coming into the artwork. So with that framework, I'm going to start talking about these because they're actually the oldest. So for a while, my artwork was really informed by mycology and mushrooms. When I first got to Davidson, I was trying to find something to make body work about, and I kept going for walks in the woods, and I kept finding mushrooms everywhere. And I thought they were so magical and majestic. And then over time, a big fad came in, which was all about mushrooms. And I really like to explore things in my artwork that most people don't look at. So all of a sudden, I kind of eventually gave up mushrooms. They became too popular and looked at for me to find it as interesting as I once did. But at the time, it was really important. And one of the things I found was actually mushrooms, when they're drying, they have so much moisture that they leave rings on your wooden tables. And very pragmatic of me to think, what's around that could soak up that moisture and not hurt my furniture? And so I was actually using art magazines because I had them. And I started putting mushrooms on them when I come in from a walk. And later I would use them as references, but they would dry up, most of them very beautifully. But then I realized, actually, what a wonderful composition. And then I started looking at them more and started thinking about the disruption of mushrooms and how they break down things as that's their beauty, right? As they can really help us to decompose things and bring freshness. And so I thought about that overlapping the art world, and I thought, oh, how wonderful, like this intervention in this space where you can see through it and see something new. So that was that. The small studies came from a trip to Hawaii. So I decided I was going to travel like I painted with the same intuition. And so I actually found Hawaii without knowing very much about it. It is an island 8 hours off the coast of Canada, and it's a Canadian island, but I could see Alaska from the beach that I stayed on. I stayed in a house that was all made from reclaimed materials, and I was there for about 2 months. There was no electricity, no plumbing, and I chopped a lot of wood and took a lot of walks and collected a lot of things, foraged. So I was foraging for wild berries, and I was making tinctures, and I was boiling wool and making things from that. And one of the things I was doing during that time is making these little studies. And one of the things I found interesting, 2 things off the beach I was collecting were agates, which you can only see out of the corner of your eye. So you'd be walking along and you just feel a presence, and it was like a twinkling, and it was an agate. And as soon as you turned, it disappeared, but you knew it was there. And I love that idea of walking through space and seeing something, but not directly. And as soon as you directly look at it, it disappears. Yeah.
That was amazing. But there's an egg. What was that?
Egg. And yeah, and so they're just these stones on the beach. And they have some transparency and translucency, and so the light refracts off of them. And so you can see them, but when you look directly at them, they don't normally look as transparent. You don't get that light, so it's magic. Yeah. The other thing were these amazing abalone shells, and I picked one up. They're huge, and they're opalescent, and so they change with the light. And to hold, like, they have power, like, and it's innate. Like, I picked it up and I was like, what is this? Like, I'd never seen one. So obviously I was curious about them. And so I actually started reaching out to people around, and I found out actually they are, by the Haida people, the native people, they are considered an extremely important artistic and spiritual presence, and they actually are used for sculptures and paintings and things like that. You can't take them off the island, I found out. And so I donated mine to an artist. I didn't, but what I did do before I did that is I spent a lot of time before I realized how protected they were, looking at its opalescence and its forms and shapes, and thinking about the wind and so much of the kind of emotion around me embedded into the landscape. And that's what those are dedicated to. What I think is really funny is, without realizing it, much later, over this past summer, I was making these tapestries in Ireland, on the west coast, in a place called the Burren, which is a karst landscape on the coast that has magical properties unto itself. But the colors were so similar. And I loved, actually, when Leah and I were hanging them, we were like, wow. Like, which I don't think, I didn't realize when I was making them, but I think they work really well together in that way. But these came from a 5-year search. So when I started making these, I was doing something. I knew I wanted a permeable surface material that would react like I saw the Burren. So in the Burren, the karst, the limestone surface, is really porous, and so it makes way for underground chambers and magical happenings. Like, for instance, you could be walking down the road, and one day there's a dry field, and the next day, without rain, all of a sudden there's a lake. And that seems pretty cool. And kind of beguiling, like, I was like, I thought there was only one way into town. How is there this huge lake? And it turns out they're called turlocks, because the karst has so many tunnels underneath. If pressure on one side of the island changes, it pushes the pressure up in another space, and water emerges from the ground from these little geysers, and with it these little eels, and there forms a lake overnight sometimes, very fast. And they're just a normal thing, but I think there's something about that permeability that holds magic. Also, it's a cleansing agent, right? So it cleans as well as, which I think is pretty amazing. So I wanted a permeable surface. I actually took the kind of the palimpsest of my studio floor, so I work in acrylic, and I took a piece of, so it's burlap. I'm gonna do a real art thing for you all. And turn it over.
Only she's allowed to.
Yeah. What you see underneath is burlap, which is a very common material that you'll find at like a garden store. And what I was doing is I was laying them face down on my plastic floor with my plastic paint refuse and dumping old paint on top of it. And so if you look, not that you can look too closely, but you can see it's actually starting to coagulate. There might be a little mold in there. Just basic things that acrylic paint does over time when it starts going bad. And so actually all of that is pulling up the plastic refuse, the acrylic refuse off my floor. And so a lot of the paint that you're seeing on this is from that. Now, I love the process, but the final product wasn't key. And so I rolled it up and put it in the corner of my studio. And years later, in fact, we had a lovely paper making workshop with an artist who came to Davidson to teach us how to make paper. We have a sustainable garden that's dedicated to paper and die making outside of the school, which you may have seen. It was with that goal in mind that we had some knowledge about how to make paper. And at the end of the workshop, she was like, does anyone want this extra pulp? And I was waiting. No, everyone was like, no. And I can't waste. Like, I'm that person who's like really has like a hard time like getting rid of old food, and it's just a lifelong challenge for me. So I was like, I'll take it. Like, knowing that I had nothing to make paper with, knowing that we were leaving in a day to go travel for 2 weeks, and I would not be able to use it when I got home. And so I was like, yeah, I'll take this, like, it was a huge amount of paper pulp. And I was like, so I got back to the studio and I was like, how am I gonna use this? And I saw those burlap pieces in the corner and I thought to myself, well, maybe that's like a service, right? That I could throw it on potentially. And maybe it'll do something. And so I did. And at first they looked awful, really, really rough. But I thought, whatever, I'm going on vacation, and I left. And when I came back, they had dried. And this kind of, again, magic alchemy happened where the paper pulp started shifting because of the dyes I'd been using underneath, and the acrylic was still showing through, and it had this like essence of paper and of fabric and of plastic, and this mixture that I think is really hard to actually find. And I found it. And so I wrote to for Davidson. Davidson supports their professors by giving them money to work over the summer, and I applied for a grant and got it to go to work in Ireland. And so what you're seeing, long story short, what you're seeing is the plastic refuse from my studio floor on the burlap. And then I took that with me to Ireland. So I had 5 tapestries, and I then collected a bunch of plastic off the beach. There's so much plastic, and actually the original paintings that made the acrylic paint for these paintings were taken from the plastics on the beach. So I was mixing colors that were similar to those plastics. So it's lovely, it's all tied together, because I went back and I found some of that plastic again, I applied it to the top, and then the only thing holding this together and binding it is paper pulp. So if we got this wet and I dumped it in water, everything that's on it, besides the original plastic of my studio floor, would fall off. It's very non-permanent, on purpose. The color you're seeing in the paper pulp is all natural pigments derived from plants that I was finding in Ireland, mostly weeds, turning them into pigment and actually letting the landscape come into these and really play a pretty substantial part in that final facade, if you will, on top. That binder being that language of earth that kind of ends up cleansing itself in a way. And so it's really thinking about how my own use of plastic that was so hard to get rid of. Like, I've been playing with acrylic paint for 30 years. Like, to like let it go was so hard, even though I knew I wanted to. It took a long time. And so this was part of my, it was a way of letting go, if that makes sense. And recognizing that a lot of our plastic use is built by habit, not by intention. And that if we just we shift our habit, and we talk about this so much at painting class, all of a sudden some things that were very hard become very easy. And that was my experience making these. It actually, once I set up the structure to make